Okay, YouTube, we've got a special guest today, Siobhan Huggins. So if you guys are interested in seeing the full conversation or seeing it fully live, head over to meterx.com. You can sign up for free. Click on the members section, click under community, and you'll be able to link to our calendar and join this live stream for free. Otherwise, just listen in and we'll let you guys have the first part of this here. All right. Siobhan, how are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Hey, I'm doing pretty well. I'm up in a place called Whidbey Island off the coast of, I guess, Washington, near kind of not too far from Seattle. It's a nice, peaceful environment. Apparently, there's a heat wave in Southern California where I just left, and it's like 100 degrees or some ridiculous amount. People are dying. So I made it out in just the right time. So somebody up here is going to meet me after this on the that also happens to live on the island that apparently knows he's going to bring some Wagyu beef and some elk for me to try. So I'm pretty
Nice.
excited actually. Pretty good.
Yeah,
I
I'd
have
be
to say you
excited
look
as well.
good. Yeah, I'm
Thank you.
saying every time I see you, you look better and better, Siobhan. So obviously what you're doing has been working for you. So that's great. So
Yeah,
um,
it's definitely still a work in progress for me. Like I still have a ways to go, so there's experimentation going on. Just recently, over the past month, I started no dairy, which
yeah,
has been helping a lot. Which is
yeah.
funny because I didn't have issues with dairy before, so it just goes to show, like,
You don't
just
know till you
keep
eliminate
trying
sometimes.
things.
That's the thing. Well, before we get into some of these details, and I definitely want to talk about it. Can you give us a little bit of your background and just, and I'll say the first time I saw your name, I mentioned this before you got on that. I was like, how the hell do you pronounce that thing? But I assume that's an Irish spelling, I'm guessing maybe. And
It
so
is.
tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, so I guess as far as health history, I started developing symptoms of depression when I was 11, and I also started gaining weight when I was 10. By the time I was 18, I had full on chronic depression and social anxiety from that depression. And I also weighed 240 pounds at that time, so I'm about 80-ish pounds down. My chronic depression is now in total remission just through diet. I also had chronic joint and back pain that is now gone. I had eczema that's now gone, besides some really mild keratosis pilaris, which I imagine will probably resolve over time. Yeah, basically everything has improved. I went keto in August of 2016, so that was 4 years ago. And then I went carnivore in, let's see, it was October of 2017 after I watched a presentation at the inaugural Keto Fest from Amber O'Hearn. And I was like, oh, I guess I'll just eat the vegetables that I like. And it turns out I don't actually like any of them.
And I was made aware of you first by you kind of working with a guy named Dave Feldman, who many of us are aware of. And are you and Dave still working together? And if so, or if not, tell me, how did that sort of eventuate? What brought you to start working with Dave?
Yeah, so I met him at that first Keto Fest. It was kind of all roads lead back to Keto Fest. I started Carnivore because of that. I started volunteering with Dave because of that. And what he was talking about with the lipid system, which is referring to fats and cholesterol and how they move through the blood and how that's regulated, he was talking about it in terms of it being very similar to a distributed object network. And at the time I was working in IT, so I was like, oh, I know what that is. I talk about it with my dad all the time. And it ended up just really catching my attention. And it was like, okay, I can understand this. I really want to learn more about it. And so immediately after Keto Fest, literally on the bus going back home, I was texting Dave and being like, do you have any resources to recommend to get into lipidology? Because I just find it really fascinating at this point and would love to learn more. And he ultimately recommended Peter Attia's The Straight Dope on Cholesterol, which I started reading, but it hurt my head. But in the first part, it recommended two textbooks, Clinical Lipidology, which I now have a physical copy of, and Therapeutic Lipidology. Those were way easier to understand and kind of gave me the basics. And Dave had kind of always been focusing on the energy side of cholesterol and how metabolism can impact it. Meanwhile, I became really fascinated by the immune side, which is, extends extremely far from inflammation and insulin resistance in general, but also to things like infection or physical injury. And I was really curious about how those things could impact cholesterol levels, and if that could partially be why we're seeing, kind of somewhat loose associations with higher cholesterol and kind of physical issues. Could it be that the disease is actually resulting in that profile, and that's why it's associating? And yeah, I still work with him. In 2018, I actually quit my IT job to work with Dave full time. I'm funded entirely by individuals through Patreon and the Cholesterol Code membership and stuff like that. So I'm really grateful for that. It means I don't take any money from companies. I can, if anyone, emails me or messages me, hey, can you review this product and we'll send you free stuff or we'll pay you, it's just immediate, no, I'm not interested. I don't need it. I don't want it. And it makes my life so much easier that way.
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating because I had Dr. Joel Kahn on the other day, and I said, "Hey, Joel, why do we have cholesterol in the body? Why do we have LDL cholesterol?" And he kind of gave us an answer. Well, some hormones, and just kind of obviously a very I would say not a very high level understanding of why we have it, even though he's a cardiologist, and it's other than it's here to kill us and make our hearts clog up. So let's talk a little bit more about certainly immune function of cholesterol and anything else you might want to comment on.
Sure. First off, it's really cool that you had Joel on. I'm glad you kind of have this dialogue with him. I think he's pretty cool. So for cholesterol, there's a bunch of different things that we can use it for. So it can be used to make steroidal hormones. So that would be things like testosterone and, stress hormones and stuff like that. But we can also use it for the structure of cells. So the cell membrane is made of, phospholipid and fatty acids, and cholesterol helps improve the rigidity of that membrane, which is really important because membranes are kind of this defense, and so they need to have a level of permeability to allow things in, but not too much because otherwise it'll just kill the cell pretty much. So we also, our immune cells can use it. So one interesting thing I found was that there's a type of parasite that can deplete one of our immune cells of cholesterol, and that prevents the immune cell from presenting antigens. So essentially taking parts of whatever it thinks is dangerous and giving it to another immune cell. And it needs cholesterol to do that. And what they found is if they added LDL to the petri dish they were working with, the immune cell would take that up and use it to replete its cholesterol stores so it could continue on with the antigen presentation, which is super cool. So that's another usage of it. The other thing is, we also use it to eat fat. So you make these things called bile acids, and that's also made of cholesterol. And so as you're eating fat, and you're ingesting cholesterol, absorbing a little bit of that, also making your own cholesterol, you then turn around and use it to digest fat as well. So it just has so many uses, and the container that carries the cholesterol is called a lipoprotein, and within that lipoprotein, there are various types, but within that, the cargo is also triglycerides, which we use for energy. It also has fat-soluble vitamins, in HDL, what they sometimes call the good cholesterol, because higher levels are associated with, better outcomes. They've also speculated that may be used as a messenger between cells to carry certain things between them, and also to carry certain hormones, fat-soluble hormones. So they're incredibly important just across the board. There is definitely a lot of debate about LDL. That's a type of lipoprotein. It's often referred to as bad, about what that is actually for. because if you start reading through it, one of the things that they'll talk about is, okay, we need this VLDL thing. We're very big creatures. We have this complex vascular system, and we need to be able to transport energy very efficiently or we'll die. That's non-debatable. So there are some papers who say we developed VLDL in order to transport this energy around the body, and as we drop off that fat cargo to the cells for use or to storage for use later, some of it will be taken up by the liver, some of those remnant lipoproteins where they've dropped off part of their cargo, but some of them will also be remodeled to LDL. And some people, in some papers will speculate that this is a waste product, it's just kind of a candy wrapper after you've eaten the candy bar kind of thing, or, wrapper around pemmican if you want to be a little bit better about it. But the reason that they say this is, well, sure, we need some cholesterol for steroidal hormones, but HDL can drop that off as well. And, the peripheral cells, say muscle cells or endothelial cells in the arteries, things like that, they can make their own cholesterol. And I think that is definitely true in a steady state. So everything is going fine, we're all good. But what I'm really curious about is, in the case of, say, injury, is that still true? And even if they can make their own cholesterol, isn't it more efficient to, instead of make something which takes energy, wouldn't you also want to use what you already have in circulation? And so one really interesting thing is that we have these proteins that are used to signal inflammation. And if you expose cells to these, again, in a Petri dish situation, then they'll start expressing receptors for LDL particles. Or you can also physically kind of mess with the cells. So there was one paper where they took endothelial cells, again, the cells lining the arteries, and they grew them in this flat sheet in the Petri dish. So very similar to what they look like in the artery. And then they just took, a little plastic thing and they scraped along the cells so they were disrupted. And when they did that, they again started expressing these receptors for LDL. They started taking up more LDL. And then as soon as they got that flat sheet formation again, so they were basically healed, they stopped putting out those receptors. So it may be that, yes, if everything is fine, the cells can kind of handle themselves. But if there's an injury of some sort, they may be using that for materials. Because like I said, cholesterol and fatty acids and all that type of stuff is used in the cell membrane. So it may be used in that context as well. So it's just so much unexplored, so much we don't really understand, but there are hints as to what may be going on.
Let me, I know that Dave is, he's like a human pin cushion. He's done, I don't know how many thousands of blood tests he's done. I don't know that you do that stuff, but I want to, one of the things that I sort of always defer to is, like when we look at actual disease versus risk factors. And, many of us in this community going on a carnivore diet, some on a high fat approach, will sometimes see, relatively high LDL cholesterol, total cholesterol, and that alarms either them or their physicians. And, and rightly so, because everybody's been trained for the last 5 decades that that's awful and it's going to kill you. And so it's obviously a little bit concerning to people. I want to ask you about, assessments. And I know Dave is trying to get some kind of study done where looking at outcomes, perhaps CIMT, perhaps CAC scores. I want to ask maybe about the CIMT. Do you find that, have you guys done any stuff on that with regard to looking at, like, say, lean mass high responders and CIMT, and how dynamic is it, and does it change, or is that something you guys haven't really explored too much?
So we do have a lean mass hyperresponder Facebook group, and so we don't have like a study or anything that's looking at CIMT and lean mass hyperresponders. The cardiovascular outcomes and risk markers and stuff like that would be the lean mass hyperresponder study that's currently going through IRB approval and all that type of stuff. But in the Facebook group, we do have people who are doing their own testing, and they'll report back. And it seems to vary. Sometimes they seem to have other things going on, in which case it can increase. Sometimes people have seen decreases. Sometimes people have seen just stabilization. In myself as well, I've had 2 done so far, and they've both been within normal range, no visual plaque spotted, nothing. And my LDL is usually like around 200, 240 or so. But I mean, it is going to need tracking over the longer term. I do a lot of testing because one of the things that Dave and I are aware of is we don't know for sure if it's higher risk. Like if we knew, then we wouldn't be doing the lean mass hyperresponder study. There'd be no point. But because we don't know, we both do a lot of extensive testing on ourselves just to verify, you know, keep an eye on things. I work very closely with my doctor on that. And so I do, you know, inflammatory markers, NMRs, lipid panels, insulin is definitely one I look at very closely. Lipoprotein little a is another one that I look at, along with CIMT and carotid Doppler, echocardiogram, just like the full thing. And I've had a CAC done just as a baseline, which was 0, which is not surprising for someone my age, but it's nice to have that verified before I get into kind of the normal testing range.
You've got a ways to go before you're old enough to have a track that's going to be of value.
Right. But I did want to get that baseline because one thing I had told my doctor who ordered it for me was, you know, my dad had a heart attack in his 40s. And granted, he was not a very healthy person. He was extremely stressed. His diet wasn't very good, all that type of stuff. But if I waited until I was 35, then that's only 5 years away from when, you know, he was in that age range of when he had his first heart attack. So it's good to have it verified, okay, here's where I'm starting from. And it's also something I talk about with other people who are just starting keto or just starting carnivore is please get your baselines. Because I don't know how many people I've seen who went keto or went carnivore for 3, 4, 5 years and they got their first CAC or their first CIMT or their first blood work and something is off, you know, a high CAC and their CIMT is in the high risk range. They don't know if that's because of carnivore. They don't know if it's because of keto. They don't know if it's because of their previous lifestyle and it's actually improved. And that level of uncertainty causes so much anxiety. And at that point, it's like, okay, now I have to follow up in 6 months, a year. But over that course of time, like how much are you anxious because you don't know if it's going to worsen or improve or stabilize or whatever. But if you have it before you start or very soon after you start, then at the very least, you know where you're coming from and can get that kind of progression. And then it's much less anxiety inducing, especially if you're seeing, you know, improvements over time. Even if it's not a perfect result, say 6 months or a year into carnivore, it's still better than it was. But the only way to know that is if you have a baseline. And I'm very lucky in that I did have baseline blood work from when I was on a standard American diet. Wasn't great. My current doctor said I probably had fatty liver, and I no longer do. So I know at least that that has improved. I know my HDL has improved. I know my triglycerides have improved. But the only way I know that is because I have before and after. So it's definitely something I try and emphasize.
Yeah, I want to, I mean, 2 things I want to comment on. I was just made aware of this is you are our 100th VIP guest, so congratulations.
Oh.
So that's cool. And then the other thing is, you know, you point out the fatty liver. I'm hearing from many, many sources, you know, as you probably are aware, we're also in the planning phases of and fundraising phases of a clinical trial. And some of the markers I'm trying to look at. One thing I'm hearing, I mean, almost unanimously from every clinician, because I'm talking to a lot of clinicians trying to figure out what markers we're likely to see, because I want to make sure we know the study design is
Definitely
solid. Is that fatty liver disease just consistently goes away with a carnivore approach, which is what I'm being told. Now, it's good to see that you've got that confirmed. I don't know if you've seen evidence to the contrary, but that seems to be the case.
I've not seen evidence to the contrary. The only thing I've seen where people said, my doctor think I have fatty liver since going keto, it turned out they were only looking at liver enzymes, and liver enzymes like AST and ALT can be affected by exercise. So in that case, what the person did is they went a week without exercising and retested, and it was normal. So that is something to take into consideration, because if you go keto, sometimes it's like a whole lifestyle thing where it's like, okay, I'm focusing on my health now. And as a result, you may end up resistance training like 4 times a week. And it's like, my liver enzymes are elevated. And it's like, okay, well, there are papers published that do specify that AST and ALT can be impacted by exercise. Even, I think it's like as far as 7 days out, it can be impacted. But I believe the same is not true of GGT, which is another kind of fatty liver metabolic syndrome marker. So I like to get that one in addition to get additional context. But yeah, I mean, Verta has seen the same thing, right? They published on markers for fatty liver getting better on keto. So I wouldn't be surprised if the same were true for carnivore as well. I mean, if you look at these kinds of conditions, what they're all kind of coming back to is, you know, the necessity for inflammation to heal from, you know, injury or irritation of some sort that could be coming from the diet, pathological insulin resistance that may be related to the inflammation, like all this stuff. So if you go on a diet like keto or carnivore that improves your diet and improves your health, I'm not surprised. You know, you may see improvements in diabetes, improvements in fatty liver, improvements in even depression like I did. I mean, if you start digging into it, you'll see inflammation and insulin resistance coming up over and over and over again. And even with autoimmune, I mean, I read a recent paper that was talking about a new hypothesis for multiple sclerosis, which is an autoimmune disease, where your body starts attacking the coating around the nerves called myelin. And the typical approach or thought to this is the inflammation and autoimmune is kind of random or genetic and it just kind of happens. But what they're speculating instead is that something may actually be damaging the myelin, and then as an immune reaction to clear up that damaged tissue, you get this autoimmune and inflammation to kind of try and heal, but for some reason that's not effectively happening. So you just have this chronic inflammation and chronic autoimmune all the time. So I have heard anecdotes of people with MS improving on carnivore, and maybe it's just that they're taking something out that was damaging the myelin or providing something that helps them repair the myelin better, something like that. I would love to see studies on that, just confirming, you know, plaque regression in the brain of people with MS on carnivore or sustained remission beyond the point of kind of remittance and relapsing, where the symptoms go away for a little while and then come back. There's a certain point where you're getting out of that time span where you would expect, oh, it's just normal MS fluctuation type of stuff. And I've certainly heard of that, but only anecdotes so far. So it makes sense to me why we may be seeing things like autoimmune conditions improving if, you know, this paper's hypothesis is true and applies not only to MS, but other autoimmune diseases as well, where it's a reaction to damaged tissue from something that we don't understand yet. So, yeah, not surprised.
Fascinating. So there's a lot in there. I'll just throw my little commentary. There's something, yeah, you probably aware of the fatty liver index, which is well, maybe not. There's a thing out there called fatty liver index, and it's sort of a non-invasive way or non-imaging way to assess fatty liver, and it does require GGT. Mm-hmm. It requires triglycerides, and it looks at waist circumference and BMI, which, you know, those can be a little bit goofy, particularly BMI. But anyway, there's a calculation. It's about an 80% correlation, you know, with actual fatty liver as confirmed by imaging. And the imaging of choice is probably going to be MRI. You know, ultrasound can still be a little bit less precise, I suppose. And as far as EMS, you know, we've seen some interesting things there. There are animal studies looking at you know, the remyelination that often will occur. And in animal studies, it cannot occur in the absence of exogenous cholesterol. That means cholesterol has to be part of the diet to allow for that remyelination. Yeah. And also there's an association between higher uric acid levels and MS being not the case. So if you have a high uric acid level, you tend not to have MS. So there, you know, I mean, obviously there's a lot of associations that are interesting, and all of those things potentially occur on a carnivore. Certainly you get more cholesterol on a carnivore diet than you do on a non-carnivore diet. And often we do see, you know, uric acid levels rise. I know Amber has proposed, or many people talk about the lack of uricase in humans, maybe being a proxy for vitamin C and so on and so forth. So yeah, you're right. There's so many fascinating topics. I wanted to go back to, you know, you said you're doing a lot of experimentation. Can you go a little more detail into that? Because I mean, you're testing a lot of things, inflammatory markers, these imaging studies. What seems to work? what seems to, for in general, you can talk about anything you want, but what are some of the confounders? I know there's, is it coffee? Is it dairy? Is it meal? There's a lot of things we've talked about. So just in general terms, if you want to go into that topic.
Yeah, so in general terms for blood testing, there's tons of confounders that can happen. Exercise is one of them, so you can see an increase in certain inflammatory markers from exercise, because anytime you're exercising, you're technically damaging the muscle, and then you have to rebuild that, and you need inflammation for that. So hsCRP is a really common inflammatory marker, and it's very sensitive. So if you exercise, say, on the morning of the test, then it may be higher. So generally, I try to only go on, light walking, not really exercising or heavy lifting or anything like that before a blood test. Not water-only fasting for 12 to 14 hours is such a big one. And that includes, like, some people will say, oh, I had coffee with butter in it 3 hours before the test. That's super common. And my triglycerides are super high. It's like, okay, well, you're probably trafficking the fat from your meal, so that's not too surprising. Coffee in itself, the caffeine and other components in the coffee can stimulate release of fat from the fat cells, so that's a temporary, short-term confounder if you have that during the fasting period. Caffeine in general will do that as well. I came across someone who had caffeine pills on the morning, and their triglycerides were high. They retested without it. It was fine. So all of that. The other thing is sometimes, it's not super common. It doesn't apply to everyone. Don't panic. But some people will have a persisting effect of drinking coffee on triglycerides. So if they, typically they're drinking coffee every single day, a couple cups a day, whatever, and they will properly fast for the test, 12 to 14 hours water only, doing all the right stuff, but their triglycerides still come back high, 200, I've seen up to 600 triglycerides, which is like, okay, what's going on there? But usually this is paired with normal to high HDL, anywhere between 50, 80, whatever. And so that's usually how I catch it is, wait, are you a coffee drinker? Oh yeah, you drink coffee every day? Okay. So it might be this. And what we usually tell people is troubleshooting, not medical advice, et cetera, but go for 10 to 14 days without coffee and retest. And usually when they do this, their triglycerides will come right back to normal. And it seems like it's dose dependent, meaning the more coffee that they have or the less coffee that they have, it'll kind of track with that. So we had someone who was doing 6 espressos a day, and then they went down to 2 espressos a day, and their triglycerides went from 600 to 200 or so. So there is that to consider. And that comes up, it seems to come up more with carnivores. The lower carb you go, the more pronounced the effect it has. So that's kind of interesting. And we've had some proposed reasons, other components in the coffee that may be causing it. I kind of need to re-review, and I'll probably do a post on cholesterol code on updated information for it, but it is fairly easy to catch. The other thing is sometimes liquid fats, just, had someone who was putting tallow in broth and not emulsifying it. They had really high triglycerides, so that's another aspect. But then again, I drink, butter tea and things like that, and I don't have that issue, so it seems somewhat individual. So for a lot of these things, what we look at is the person gets a test first, and then, they could be doing any number of things. They could be having coffee, they could be having, liquid fats in their diet, but their lipid panel and everything is fine. No further troubleshooting needed. It's really the people who have a test done and then they see something wonky where we're saying, okay, have you checked this? Have you checked this? Have you checked this? So more of a response to something being weird rather than assuming it will be just because they're doing these things. Let's see, yeah. For myself, the experimentation that I've been doing is, I did keto for a while. I did a whole bunch of stuff within that realm. I did, egg fasting a couple of years ago, which is really just an elimination diet. And let's see, I had been carnivore for a while and my weight had kind of stalled and I wasn't really eating anything weird. But I had seen it going around that people were doing higher fat carnivore and seeing results kind of similar to PKD, where it's, 2 grams of fat per 1 gram of protein. And the way that I like to approach it is I would eat the fat first until I was fat full, and I would still be protein hungry. So then I would eat the lean after that. And it came out to like 3-to-1 in that case. And it's going to vary between different people depending on needs. But when I did that, I started losing weight again. It's like, okay. And now I've experimented with it enough to where I know if I have multiple higher protein days, I'll start gaining weight back. So that's fun. But I know a lot of people do really well with higher protein carnivore, probably yourself included. So it's another case of, don't assume, this will work or won't work. You really do have to try it for yourself. And so what I usually tell people now are like, well, what kind of carnivore do I do? Is it's like try higher protein and try higher fat and then do the one that gets you closer to your goals. So for me, that's higher fat carnivore. And I had done an experiment that I regret and I don't regret because I learned so much from it, but it was miserable, which is last year in July, I had done a high carb experiment, and it was high carb, low fat. It was like black beans and chicken breast and stuff. And it was for the data. I didn't enjoy it, and it actually had long-lasting impacts on my mood. So that experiment was 8 days long. And for 2 months after that experiment, I had really weird mood fluctuations, crying randomly for no particular reason, really self-critical. I had done a presentation at Keto Fest right after that experiment, literally like a couple days later. And now it's one of my favorite presentations I had ever done. But at the time, I was like, man, you really messed that up. You really blah, blah, blah. Just like all this self-critical talk. Meanwhile, people were coming up and being like, I'm really glad you talked about that. I totally understand where you're coming from. Like, obviously positive feedback. And because I have this experience of being depressed and not being depressed and having anxiety and not having anxiety, I can kind of look at, okay, what's actually happening in my environment and what is my reaction to that? And these two right now are not lining up. So something else is going on. And it took 2 months to get way closer to normal. But even after that, I was still having weird bouts of just waking up and crying for no reason. It was much less frequent. It was much less severe, but it was still happening. But I had immediately after that experiment gone right back to high-fat carnivore. And for some reason, I don't remember why, I was like, okay, I'm going to try no dairy experimentation again. Because the other thing that had happened from that experiment is I had gained 17 pounds, not only during the experiment, but in the weeks after. I kept gaining, even though I went back to carnivore, which was not cool. And I'm only 5'2", so 17 pounds is a lot on me. And believe me, I got plenty of people telling me, hey, you're carnivore, but you're gaining weight. It's like, yeah, I know. It was after this experiment that it started happening. And so when I did the no dairy, I did a quick succession of very small single meal experiments where I would have, just burger patties with butter one day, and then burger patties with butter and half an ounce of cheese. And then a couple days later after a washout, burger patties with butter and 2 ounces of cheese. And what I realized was that when I included the cheese, so included the dairy, I wouldn't get satiated at the meal. I would just keep eating and eating until I got bored. It was like, okay, I don't want to eat anymore. But it wasn't that feeling of like, I can't eat another bite. That never happened when I was including cheese. And it was disturbing, to say the least. And the other thing that happened with the 2 ounces of dairy is later that day I got so hungry I ended up binging even more on dairy. And then the very next day I had this huge mood crash that came out of nowhere. And so from there it's like, okay, I guess I won't be having dairy for a while. And so it seems like that high carb experiment, almost the context during the experiment bled over into what I was eating after. I mean, this is a random hypothesis speculation. I don't know if it's true, but it makes sense. Where immediately after that experiment, I went right back to high-fat carnivore with dairy. And then immediately after that is when I started reacting to dairy in that way. So that's great. But so for the last month, I've not been including dairy. It's still high-fat carnivore and not including spices that bother me. And if I ever do include dairy again, I immediately gain like 5-6 pounds overnight, and it won't come off for like a week. So it's like, cool. So it's another thing of like constant experimentation. Even if something worked for you before, just if you're having issues and you can't figure out what it is, sometimes it is helpful to revisit things again and be like, okay, maybe some context changed here somewhere, and now I am more sensitive to this for some reason. And I, see that sometimes in people. Or one really interesting case of needing something extremely specific is April, who was interviewed on the Keto Woman podcast. She had been keto for 2 years, and her diabetes wasn't resolving. She was still 300 pounds. She wasn't losing any weight. She had done carnivore for a month, and that wasn't helping. But she, even through all of that, she didn't give up, and she kept experimenting. And finally, I was talking to her like, why don't you try high-fat carnivore for a little while and just see what it does, because it's one thing you haven't tried yet. And she did, and a couple weeks into that, her triglycerides were coming down, her blood sugar was going into the normal range. Her insulin didn't really move, but I wouldn't expect that to come down for a while in someone who was having issues that was so severe. Her hunger was much improved. She was able to spontaneously start fasting just because she wasn't hungry. But it was like this really specific intervention that she needed of not just carnivore, not just high-fat carnivore, but high-fat carnivore without spices, essentially without any potential dietary irritants. She was even having trouble with chicken and pork. She had to stick to beef. And yeah, so it's just experimentation. If you're not getting the results that you want, like, don't give up. There's so many different variations, even in carnivore, where it's like, okay, maybe it's this thing, maybe it's this thing. Maybe, you do need some supplementation if you do have a demonstrated deficiency, and that's the bottleneck that's preventing you from getting results. Like, I supplement B vitamins because I have a demonstrated folate deficiency that I think is pre-existing. And so it's like, as a standard person may not need supplementation, but there are certain contexts where you do blood work and it's like, oh, maybe I do actually need this. And I could eat liver, but I tried that and it made me physically ill after a while. So I just, stick with supplementation. It's just the easiest thing. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, I mean, it answers the question. There's a lot of stuff there. I want to just sort of delve a little bit into, because you said I was doing steak plus butter, and then I added the cheese. And so obviously butter and cheese are both dairy products, but have a little bit different profile. And then do you feel, because there's a lot of recent talk about, when we look at saturated fats, I mean, there's, if you start with the short chain fatty acids with, butyrate and propionate and acetate, and you start working your way up to the medium chains, which would be capric, caprylic, and caproic acids, and then you get into the sort of the, and I think lauric's in there, and then you start to get the myristics and the palmitic and the oleic and stearic acids as you get longer and longer. Any thoughts to those, different ratios that are in different foods? For instance, cocoa butter is our highest source of stearic acid, quickly followed by, beef tallow, and butter has stearic acid, has quite a bit actually. But do you feel that these differences also make an effect? And what's the difference between cheese and milk and yogurt and butter and ghee? Is there stuff in there? And then the other question, I know I'm throwing a lot at you, is when you say I'm on high-fat carnivore, and one, I'd ask you what your fat sources are. I mean, but two, now that you're not using dairy, and then two, do you think you think calories are still having an effect? That is to say, is it a satiety impact where you're eating high fat, but you're still eating a relatively lower amount of calories than you might have been on a leaner approach?
So the first question, the different levels of fatty acids, I don't know, honestly. I don't know what sort of difference it makes. I have heard people who are like, oh, I can't eat traditional pork and chicken because it makes me hungrier type of thing. I don't know if that's because it's leaner or if it's because of the type of fat that they have. I had been hanging out with Brad, who has the blog fireinabottle.net, and you might want to have him on, even though he's a bit controversial. I think he does have some value add, because he does talk a lot about the different types of fatty acids and the different impacts they have on physiological insulin resistance and satiety and all that type of stuff. So he'd be a better person to ask. But Yeah, second question, what are my fat sources? I have various ones. I tend to like cycle through them. So butter is definitely one of them. One of my favorites, I don't seem to have a reaction to butter or ghee, but I do have reactions to things like heavy cream or hard cheeses or soft cheeses or basically any other form of dairy. Fat on meat or in meat is definitely a big source. So I just buy these like pre-frozen, pre-formed burger patties that are 100% beef, and it's 70-30, so it's higher fat. And then I'll add butter on top of that. Or at a butcher in Boulder called Black Belly that I'd highly recommend if you're in town. They have these pork chops that have this really thick fat cap, and I really like those. And in that case, with pork, I think it depends a lot on, first of all, the breed, and then second of all, the what the pigs are fed. That's going to impact their fat quality. And the fat on this is quite firm, which suggests to me it's higher in saturated fat. And the reason that I actually like it is because when you cook it, it doesn't get all like mushy and gross. So there's that as well. And then sometimes I'll also pick up just pork fat trimming from the butcher or a local farm, and I'll cut it into like 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch cubes. And I'll add it to a jar with vinegar and clove and cinnamon and ginger, and I'll just pickle it, and it kind of tastes like applesauce a little bit. It's sort of like a desserty sweet taste, even though there's no sweetener or anything in there. I really love that. It's super filling and awesome. I have tried it with lamb fat before, but lamb fat is kind of stringy when it's cooked almost. It falls apart in sort of layers, which doesn't lend itself to pickling very well. I'm a very texture picky person, so I tend to reject things pretty easily. So yeah, fat from just meat and animals. Sometimes I'll eat like raw beef fat. That's what I did for the high-fat carnivore experiment, because I actually set it up as an experiment where I got blood work before, throughout, and after. I also did weigh-ins through the whole thing pretty much every day. And I tracked calories too, so I can answer this question. And from what I remember of the write-up, if you go on cholesterol code and look up high-fat carnivore, my write-up on it will pop up. The calories were about equivalent. So it was like 1,750 or like 1,800 for the high protein carnivore, and then 1,700 or something. So the higher calories was the high protein, and then for the higher fat it was like 1,700 something. So it didn't change that much, and I was losing weight really rapidly, to where even if there was a difference, and there was a slight difference, it wasn't really enough to explain the rapid weight loss, as far as I'm aware, unless I was keeping energy expenditure the same. I was going on, the same amount of walks every day. Wasn't going out of my way to exercise more or anything like that. But there's always, creating more heat from brown fat that can burn off calories. You can breathe out calories. You can do a whole bunch of different things that I had no way of tracking. So it's possible my energy expenditure went up, but it was just not in a noticeable way. Like, I think calories are a thing, like they exist. It's just that the system is so complex that I just don't see a point in tracking them. And usually what I do instead is I look at, what is giving me satiation, what is making it so that I can, not eat for a couple days, because I still have a lot of fat on me. I can do that comfortably. When I was doing higher protein carnivore, I would struggle to fast beyond even 24 hours, and I would just get hungry really soon after. So those are more the things that I look at in terms of energy intake, because I feel like they're actually more reliable, even though they're more subjective. So things like that. Calories, like my joking response to people is, I don't know what a calorie is. Don't use that word. So.
I do wonder, relative because, there is a relative difference between the insulinogenic effect of fat and protein. And so if you're eating a higher protein diet, you probably have more circulating insulin that may have as we know from us in the ketogenic space, know that will have an impact on the kidney's ability to hold sodium in water. And so do you think some of that was due to fluid shifts? I mean, can you say that it was definitely fat loss, not just weight loss? How did
Yeah.
you quantify that?
So I had been doing measurements as well, and I think over that 3.5 weeks, I lost like 2 inches off of my waist or something like that. I also lost pretty much everywhere else. And the other thing that I notice with fluid shifts is if you're losing water weight, it tends to be a lot all at once. While with things that I associate with fat loss, it tends to be, maybe when I went no dairy, I was losing like 3/4 of a pound or so every day, but it was consistent and it was a slower amount of weight loss. So it wasn't a couple pounds all of a sudden overnight, which might happen if I have some spices that irritate me. I'll gain like 2 pounds and then the next day I'll lose the 2 pounds again. That's more what I would expect from water weight shifts, but the slower, longer term, consistent loss seems to be more so fat loss. And that's what I was seeing both with high fat carnivore and getting rid of dairy after I became sensitive to it. So I do think it was fat loss. And I also had progress pictures, which I didn't post, obviously. But I was starting to see an abdominal column. So like baby abs. So body composition changes essentially were definitely happening. And it was a slower change over time where it was, I was seeing more and more shadows on the abdomen at first and then clearly defined changes, which again suggests to me it was actually fat loss.
Very good. I saw somewhere in there's a question about sort of differences between the sexes, males, females. Do you feel that in your experience can we make generalizations? Women do better on high fat approach, men do better on high protein approach. Is that something you've seen borne out in your observations, or is it just different? Everybody's different type of thing.
I don't think it has anything to do. I mean, if it might have something to do with gender and sex, but I've not seen anything. I've seen consistent results from both men and women doing better on high-fat carnivore, but there does seem to be a difference between who does better on higher protein and who does better on higher fat, and I think it's health context that seems to be playing in. So it's really like the problem cases I'm seeing, like lingering autoimmune, lingering weight, lingering diabetes. In my case, it was lingering weight and keratosis pilaris, which is, associated with lingering insulin resistance type of stuff. So I think it has more so to do with that, where if you're a really fit, athletic guy, your insulin's already low, you may do better on higher protein because, maybe you're needing that extra energy for something if you do have lingering health issues, or you're not as able to access your own fat because you still have a bit of pathological insulin resistance and higher insulin going on, things like that. And then adding in extra energy may actually be beneficial for you if you can't as easily access your own. But if you're metabolically healthy, all that type of stuff, you may be able to access your own fat perfectly fine, in which case, higher protein may be beneficial. So from what I've seen, it's more health context that's playing in. Not so much gender or sex or anything like that. I've seen consistent results in both if they had lingering issues and they tried higher fat carnivore and things like that. And it does kind of make sense because ICMNI, who uses PKD, they do tend to focus on problem cases, and that's where they're kind of seeing their benefit. Things like cancer and diabetes and autoimmune conditions, that's what they're using the high fat carnivore for. So it does seem to be a bit more of a targeted approach. But the other thing is, another thing that people will sometimes see a difference in is satiation. So if they're following higher protein, but they're still kind of hungrier, they may just need extra energy. Maybe they're already really lean, or something like that, where they just feel better with higher fat. So it does seem to be individual, does seem to be based on context, which is why I usually don't recommend a specific approach. If someone is asking, it's like, I don't know what's going to work for you. Try both and just do the one that works. Like I like saying everyone should go high fat carnivore or anything like that. I don't see a point in saying that.
Yeah, I agree. I can't disagree with that aspect there. And I do, and my experience in this community, and I'm here every single day getting feedback, is I think you probably hit it on the nail on the head with the tougher cases, the people with the lingering issues. That is definitely a very, very effective tool there. And then that differentiates somebody who's relatively metabolically healthy and doing it just to maybe lean out and improve the gym performance. And like I said, I've done high fat, high protein, and I've given myself a little bit more liberty to experiment, as I've kind of I've done 3 years of eating a bunch of steaks and it didn't kill me. And I'm pretty confident I can say that you can survive, or many people can that way. So it's fun to kind of do some of the stuff. One of the things that I'm seeing, because I read through a lot of literature. That's most of my reading is scientific literature, and I look at different things, and I'm looking at different interventions that are done out there. And what I'm finding is a lot of the things, like for instance, I was looking at an article on blood sugar and alcohol, and for many people, particularly when they look at type 1s and type 2 diabetics, they see that alcohol tends to drive down gluconeogenesis, and they end up with lower blood glucose. And I did some with. I never drink coffee. I just never liked. I did that with caffeine, and it was a disaster. It raised my blood glucose. I was like, ugh. And so the alcohol, supposedly, when you drink alcohol, it's supposed to lower it. So I've done this experiment the last 2 days, and I don't even like to drink that much alcohol. Quite honestly, I've never been one that's like, oh, good, I get to drink all this alcohol. I don't like. Honestly, I don't like the way it makes me feel that much. So I was checking blood glucose in the morning, and no, doesn't lower it for me. So it may be in the context that, because most of these studies are done in high carb people. I mean, almost all these studies are done eating 60, 55% carbs, 50% carbs, and you see that stuff, and then they do these experiments. So, and it may just be obviously very individualized, but I mean, I think it's necessary for the zero carb, the carnivore community to do these experiments, on our own, because it's a different starting point. It's a different baseline. And, like I said, when you are shutting down gluconeogenesis via alcohol, it might be because, you've got a higher, or even like a high fat versus higher protein approach. You've got different substrates growing in, which make gluconeogenesis a relatively higher component of that. And when it's already, the baseline is already low, you're not going to bring it much lower, and so if it's relatively high, if you've got all these gluconeogenic precursors floating around with different amino acids, then you might see a bigger effect. I'm not sure, but that's just something I've seen, and it's interesting that we're in here doing these experiments.
Yeah, definitely. It might be another context thing, like you said. Yeah, I've heard it inhibits glucagon and stuff like that, and it may be that the physiological insulin resistance in carnivore and low carbers is such a priority that that's to a lesser extent. I have heard, I think it was Gary Fettke mentioned it, like at the end of one of his presentations or something, how he had been experimenting with wine while wearing a continual glucose monitor, and he had seen his blood sugar go lower. But I do wonder if, if you're doing something like you where you're exercising like a freaking beast and you need that gluconeogenesis to supply the energy, it may just be that it outcompetes with the alcohol or something like that. I have no idea. But I totally agree. It's something I had been talking about with a friend of mine, and I was like, it's very disheartening that so much of this work hasn't already been done, because ketogenic diets have been around. Like it's the OG diet, right? But it's also very exciting because now we get to do it. We get to replicate all these experiments and say, oh, in this context, that's not actually true. Or the associational studies where it's like, oh, high fiber diets associate with blah, blah, blah. It's like, okay, but that may actually just be like an indicator of income, an indicator of health consciousness, whatever. But if you're in this context where you're not eating any fiber, then it's probably not associating with anything, because you could already be healthy and it's just a different way to be healthy. So yeah, I'm looking forward to a ton of research application, things like that. And The other thing is, like, with the alcohol thing, if you're like, oh, alcohol can lower blood glucose, whatever, and someone has higher glucose, let's say they're coming back from diabetes or something and they're still in that transitional phase, they may go out and try to, drink alcohol to drive their blood sugar down or take whatever stuff. But the thing I keep coming back to is, what we see in diabetes is very similar to what we're seeing in extremely severe infection. So it could be immune activation is diabetes, chronic immune activation. And so you have the higher glucose, the higher triglycerides, the higher insulin, the pathological insulin resistance, just like every single aspect you will also sometimes see in infection. And so it could be the previous diet has caused some sort of damage or some sort of irritation, and you have to heal from that before you'll see insulin come down and triglycerides come down and whatever, like we saw with April. Like, you have to give the proper environment. And what is the high glucose for in infections is to feed immune cells so that they can do their job. So it's like, if you're targeting a marker because it's bad, well, we also have to think, what is that marker for? What are the high triglycerides for? What's the high insulin for? I mean, insulin can modulate immune function from, the in vitro studies and stuff that we have. It can help T cells, do their job better. It can help macrophages do their job better. And so it's like, if you're inhibiting something that's a part of the immune system, are you making a trade-off there? Where in someone with extremely severe diabetes, where they're taking insulin, taking things to lower their glucose, that may be a worthy trade-off until they can resolve their own issue, because we know extremely high glucose is not good. But if you're in this transition phase where it's kind of midline, what is that doing? That's another study that needs to be done. Is inhibiting glucose helpful? All that kind of stuff. It's just such an unknown. And I really wonder, because I keep coming back to the immune system over and over and over again. And this focus on markers and, this marker is associated with this thing, so we have to drive it lower. It's like, but a lot of this stuff is there for a reason. So what are we actually doing? I don't think we know.
Siobhan, I mean, that's an excellent point, and I've made that sort of analogy on a lot of cases, as well as its context and that type of stuff. And it's kind of I interviewed Chava Toth, I don't know how long ago, and obviously when you talk to Chava, it's through a translator, and there was like just a one-off comment. It was a very passing comment, and I asked him about insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia, and he just waved his hand and said, no, that's not the deal. It's really what's coming in through the gut. And as you know, the gut is our biggest really immune interface. I mean, if we look at the amount of the immune system that's in our gut, it's most of our immune system in our body is our gut, because that's our primary interface. That's our primary. Most people don't realize this, but our gut is our primary interface with the external environment. Even though it's inside of us, we are literally a creature that is wrapped around an external tube, and our skin basically keeps everything out, but our gut is designed to absorb everything in, or certain things in, and so it's a very different interface. So it's really the gut is really the main interaction with the external environment. And so when you look into it deeper, it's like, maybe that's the case. I mean, I think the real answer is, we obviously don't know, but it's certainly a worthwhile hypothesis. I'll let you respond to that, Siobhan, and then unfortunately, this has gone by so quick. We have to do this some more and do it again, I think. I've got to go, unfortunately, go do some things. No, I'm not unfortunate, but anyway, we've been an hour, and it's been wonderful. So respond to that little last comment if you feel you need to, or you can, and then tell us where to find more about what you're doing and where people can find you, and social media, so on and so forth.
Yeah, for sure. I think the gut thing is big. I mean, a lot more of what we're seeing does seem to be related to what we're eating, how we're interacting with the environment. Anything interacting with the mucous membrane is going to, play in, probably smoking, all this type of stuff. And yeah, so the way I typically think of inflammation and insulin resistance now, if it's, pathological insulin resistance, not physiological, is I tend to think of it as probably a reaction to something. So I'm not saying, stop taking your insulin, blah, blah, blah. That would be ridiculous. Please don't kill yourself on my behalf. I am saying, if we can find the root cause, me personally, I would want to focus on that, because it means I'm leaving my immune system to do whatever. And sure, I may have some interventions that interfere with it a little bit for quality of life reasons, we already know not treating it at all is bad. So interim treatment while focusing on the actual cause of it, I think, is a great way to go about it. And people seem to be doing that with ketogenic and carnivorous diets, even if we don't fully understand why. And obviously, if you're on diabetic medication or blood pressure medication, this is why you need to work closely with your doctor, because if you're focusing on the underlying cause, you may not need those really, really fast. And taking too much insulin or too much of a blood pressure medication is not good. So that's why, I think Westman, for example, has said these things may need to be lowered within a day. So you do need to be really careful about that as you're taking them and recovering and stuff like that. As far as where you can find me, I'm most active on Twitter. It's at Siobhan_Huggins. Hopefully there's like show notes or something where you can put that in so people don't have to try and spell it. I'm also very active on cholesterolcode.com. If you have like lipid or blood work related questions, I can't give medical advice because I'm not a doctor, but I can offer my opinion. And that is best to go in the cholesterol code comments, because I do look at those every day and we respond to every question that comes in there.
Siobhan, thank you very much for not only this interview, for what you do in general, you and Dave and other people like you guys that are, making us think, use our brains a little harder, and because we've got a lot of, I think a lot of, things we just don't know. And I think we've got a lot of people that assume we know it all, and clearly we don't. I certainly don't.
Yeah, I don't either.
I'm the first one to say I don't know it all. And I think that's, helpful for most people. Most people would say that we'd be in a better place. Okay, guys, thanks everybody for attending. This has been great. We'll be back tomorrow with another one of these, and you guys have a great day. And Siobhan, I look forward when I can see you in person again. Hopefully we'll be back on the, lecturing circuits and meeting as like actual real human beings again. Anyway, take care now. All right, everybody, bye-bye.